So, greetings, felicitations, and good morning, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. Today, we're going to talk about R.C. Clarke's mysterious world. Got mysterious world. I've got the book over here, actually, mysterious world. R.C. Clarke's Imperial Earth, which I've been reading along with Gavin at Genre Books, and
Hello.
that's my copy I've been reading there.
My copy.
Um, Still not enamored with either of the covers. Mine's by Terry Pastor, who I don't know who he is. Actually, R.C. Clarke's Mysterious World. Got the book there? No, I haven't. Any movement behind me, there's a Sharpei wandering behind me looking out the window, so I don't know what's going to go on there. But yes, so I finished this earlier this week, and Gavin finished his bit before me because he's quicker than I am at the moment. And he's trying to get me to love R.C. Clarke.
I'm not sure this is going to be exactly the book
It's
to achieve
I have
that.
opinions, but I think
Do you want to start and be your first?
Yeah, I will start off with saying there will be spoilers to hell to this, as there always is in these things. So if you don't want to know the plot, not that it's particularly exciting and enamoring and wow, big reveal at the end or anything. So, but there will be spoilers. But basically, I've just written a quick synopsis of the story here, which I basically vaguely stole off of Wikipedia because it was easier. Basically, the plot follows a family, a sort of dynasty on the moon of Titan who settled Titan. And best way to describe it is their then dealings with Earth. They've been people go to Titan because they wanted the hydrogen for the engines to go back and forth, and because hydrogen was easier to get off of Titan than it is to get off of Earth because of the amount of fuel it takes to lift weight and stuff and things like this. I don't know where I'm making it. And the drive was called the asymptomatic drive, which I thought was which improves specific impulse and thrust by orders of magnitude. So basically, Titan's economy is via hydrogen, but this is letting off, and it is the centenary on Earth. So one of the not brothers, one of the dynasty of people called Mackenzie is going to go to Earth to this big event and hopefully open some trade deals. So the Mackenzies, spelt weirdly without a C because of some weird thing they say on when it was entered somewhere or something.
It's just an admin error, isn't it?
Admin error or something. Are clones basically. So you have the first one who is you get Colin and Duncan, who are the two. Duncan is the clone of Colin, and Colin is the clone of Malcolm. And as the book opens up, it all gets a bit confusing when there's Collins and Duncans, and I didn't know what the hell was going on at one point.
So do we call them a batch rather than a dynasty?
Yeah. But the reason they're clones is because of all Malcolm, the original space, or the tuna from him, basically it affected his genetics, so he couldn't have children. But the one thing that got me is he had a child with his wife, and I thought this was brutal. Where is it down here? They had he married a woman called Ellen. I don't know where he married, and they had a child called Anitra. And the way Clarke has written this, and it said she was never be able to speak, and there was no one really at home in the lovely shell the bodies had fashioned. And then
I mean that's quite uncomfortable, and I think
there's a line afterwards saying everybody was happy when she died, and as it's a subject that's quite sort of close to me, I was thinking, you're saying nobody's home, but how do you mean? Is this Clarke's point of view, or is he trying to put it as the point of view of the characters about their thoughts about life and stuff? And I just found it quite uncomfortable, I must admit.
I think we'll return to this later in the book as well, because there is another section where it's just like a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's it. This is the line. To the mingled sorrow and relief of an entire world, Anitra had died before she was 6 years old, and the Mackenzie marriage died with the flurry of grief and recrimination. It was just the mingled sorrow and relief of the entire... That phrasing I just thought was quite brutal.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know anything about his own life in that respect, to know whether, you know, if he's writing from a certain sort of position. But it seems quite cold in a way.
Yeah. But the other weird thing about this thing is they said that the child had born and wasn't speaking, and because they had no child psychologist, and I thought, well, a pretty decent GP would be able to diagnose half of this issues going on here.
Yeah.
And I thought they must have had doctors there. But
it does seem a pretty sort of rough and ready frontier existence that they're leading on Titan. There doesn't seem to be that many children, so you'd think you wouldn't have specialist doctors, but the plan is to expand the population of the planet, by orders of magnitude. So you would have thought they'd be putting a little bit of planning in that respect.
But yeah, so the beginning of this book, it sort of sets up this, and then Malcolm goes off after Anitra dies, and then he goes to Earth and clones himself and comes back with Colin. Sorry, yes, Colin. And then basically we jump forward, and then Colin does the same thing to get Duncan, who's the main sort of protagonist. And then we do bits around Titan with his friend called Carl, who is being set up for some stuff later, and this girl who comes to visit, who I cannot remember her because they have some spaceships. Kalindi, that was it. I knew it was a weird name. It was Kalindri that they sort of have this sort of vague sort of relationship with, and then he gets a bit jealous when Carl sort of gets her, sort of at one point.
Yeah, I mean, and this bit is, I mean, there's some stuff going on here as well, which is quite progressive in a way.
Oh yes, it's very progressive. He's there's a line which I can't remember what it is, basically saying male, female, whatever, as long as a relationship. And I thought, this is in 1974, and for him to
this is this is 1976 that this is being published, because this is published in the 200th anniversary of the United States, because the book is set for the celebrations of the 500th. There's it is a very sort of socially liberal future. So, I mean, the implication here is that Duncan, this latest clone, is bisexual. I mean, he doesn't sort of explore it very much, but he can't understand why anyone would want to stick to one.
Yeah, but that almost could refer to Clarke, because Clarke was gay, but he never really told anybody. Like, everybody in the science fiction world knew it, but nobody it was a bit sort of, nobody admitted it. He lived with his friend for a very many years, who I can't remember when he died, because his partner, who was actually from Sri Lanka as well, but it was one of these, wasn't a secret, but he didn't tell people about it.
Yeah, it was probably
because in the 60s
the situation was in Sri Lanka. I mean, it was bad enough.
Well, male homosexuality in the UK was illegal till 67, 68, wasn't it?
Yeah,
technically. So he grew up for all that period, so he got used to not telling anybody, because you didn't. And I said Sri Lanka is probably quite a Catholic country as well, and it's not the sort of thing you're going to
aside from sort of the sexuality of the main character, you only find out probably about 2/3 into the book he's a person of color as well.
Yes, that was quite a surprise, because
but the way he writes it is like, well, why would that be a surprise?
Yes,
this is 500 years later.
It's something about, they were saying that he was the same color as, was it somebody? But there was a thing about saying that there was very few.
He just described it as, of course, Duncan was several shades darker than.
But he was darker. But they were saying that it was very rare, because obviously the whole of the population got very homogenized, almost implying the fact that to have somebody that dark was quite a sort of wow.
And the implication being there's no one very white either.
Yeah.
The world president is a woman.
Yes, actually, I didn't
know. It's there's sort of sexual liberation here as well. I mean, there's implications there of freedom between those characters.
Yes, there was actually, wasn't there?
there is plenty of shenanigans that happen in Zero Gravity, which he doesn't go into detail about it, but I do find it quite funny. He says there's some sort of illicit book called the NASA Sutra, that made me laugh. But yeah, I mean, sort of generally from that perspective, it does fit into the overarching theme in Clarke's literature of a hopeful future. Now, whereas normally this is done on a sort of technical and scientific basis, here it is much more to do with the people themselves. We've certainly moved on from his writings in the 50s and the 60s, where you are sort of smoking your pipe in the rocket and you are cooking sausages in your moonlander and all of this sorts of stuff. He's much more thinking about society in space rather than transplanting the existing society that he sees and sticking it into a sort of a scientific future.
I said that because there's quite a lot, because obviously he's hit all the new wave of science fiction, so there's a lot of quite progressive stuff going on in science fiction literature at this time anyway. So to stay relevant, he had to move forward to a degree anyway.
Yeah.
But most writers will. They will style and their stuff develops in time, as it is anyway. I said anyway too many times there. But yes, so his style would have to change as you're going along. But if you look at his writing history, as sort of some of the writers from his era, you think sort of Asimov, Heinlein, that he's not as prolific as them in his writings. I don't like.
No.
Well, nobody's as prolific as Asimov because he went on and wrote ridiculous amounts, but he's still not as prolific as some of the other ones. But he had a lot of other interests, which I think fed into this book and fed into what I've read of him quite well. All his scientific interests and lots of outside interests that feed into all his literature, which I think probably enabled, as you said, the more progressive background to actually work. Because if you read Asimov, I love Asimov, but his futures don't feel as progressive as this one did.
No, I mean Asimov can't. Asimov is another one who just transplants the existing social situation he sees and puts it into the far future.
Yeah,
I mean, there's very few female characters you can talk about in Asimov. There aren't that many in Clarke, but there are more. And I mean, here you have the grandmother, who is
a bit of a matriarch, isn't she? Really?
I mean, and she's a real. I mean, she's a quandary. She's obviously she's divorced. I'm going to say the grandfather because it just makes it a little bit easier. So the first generation clone.
Yeah.
She's divorced him. She doesn't even recognize the next generation down, Colin. She just doesn't want to know. I think, maybe she's thinking, he's gone off and basically done this without me. But she's really taken Duncan under her wing. And she's someone that she's matriarchal, and they all seem scared of her. But she's like, she's sort of fearsomely intelligent as well. And she's really sort of looked up to by Duncan. Not just as a sort of grandmother figure, but as a sort of fellow scientist as well.
But the family, it reminded me of, as much as I found sort of, especially Malcolm and Colin, it felt quite narcissistic what they were doing. This cloning arc. It's got to be, you think yourself that good that you think a perfect copy of you is the only way to go. No consideration of, adoption or anything like that. It's straight down the, I've got to clone myself because I can't have children, which is it is a narcissistic thing to think and do in reality. But later on, Duncan develops more of a rounded character than the other two, because we obviously spend more time with him. And it reminded me of have you read the Dorset books, Gordon Dixon's Dorset books?
No.
There's the main people who are the mercenaries in that, called the Grahams and their family. And Duncan's attitude just put me in the mind of that. It made me, as I was reading it, just sort of made me think of that. because they're quite, like him, almost quite aloof, but they're sort of observing stuff. They're not sort of people, even though they're mercenaries, they're not people of action. They more assess situations and work from those situations. And that's what he was doing. Because the first, I will warn anybody who reads it, the first 60-70% of this book is basically a travel log. It is Duncan, you have the initial setup on Titan, and then you have him traveling to Earth, and not a lot really happens. It's like a tour of the galaxy, but I found that quite interesting because it pulled the world in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of real sort of slice of life to begin with. So, I mean, that whole section on Titan, I mean, it is quite slow. And the tourist bit, I'm going to say the tourist bit. So when Duncan travels to Earth, I think that's actually where it does pick up quite a bit, because I really enjoyed that sort of middle section, because he's treating Earth as the alien planet. Clarke is treating Earth as the alien planet. You've got Duncan is meeting farm animals for the first time.
Yeah.
And sort of it's the way it's being described is he is seeing this with sort of brand new eyes.
And actually the description is good. When he meets the horse and he's almost absolutely terrified by a horse. And you think, you see a horse up close, they're huge. So
yes. Yeah, and he's like trying to figure out, so wait a minute, it isn't a cow, so it must be
it's not got horns, it's not.
And sort of bits like he's trying to get to sleep. And it's just like, well, you don't, of course, so on Earth, if you're trying to sleep and you've got all the sounds of nature outside your window, which just doesn't happen in on a dead planet like Titan. So he literally just can't drop off because there's insects buzzing and birds outside.
It sounded like a bat went into his room or something.
Yeah.
And he just sort of hides under the covers, which I found quite funny.
So I mean, the Mackenzies are described as these sort of frontiersmen of the Imperial Earth out there in the farthest reaches in Titan. But it isn't until he gets to Earth that he sees like a real sort of wilderness, because everything in Titan is very much sort of self-contained. Most of it is indoors, and then he's in this big open space, and he doesn't have to wear a gas mask or anything like this. So it does flip it the alien visiting experience entirely.
But it did almost, the way the Earth was set up, did almost feel museum-like, which I think was purposeful to almost make you, because they're almost looking back at the past rather than looking towards the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's an underpopulated Earth. From what I mean, I think at some point, from memory, he says there's 500 million people on Earth.
Yeah,
which isn't a lot, and sort of is suggesting that they're all over the shop, because they are all over the solar system by this point. You've got people on the moon, you've got people on Mars, and people sort of starting to go to all of these other moons. There's not a huge amount of people, but there's enough of them. And yeah, we're not looking at 8 billion people. We're looking at sort of 16th of that population. So you're not seeing any of the normal things you would see with the future. There's very few dystopic elements there, because they're not overpopulated. No one's starving. No one's at war. Everyone seems to be sort of fairly homogenized between the nations as well as between the peoples.
Yeah. But what he did get wrong was, well, I don't know where he got wrong, this idea that America would be the biggest thing, and so the planet would basically be America, which I found quite interesting from an English writer, that he made that assumption.
I mean, he's always a big sort of transatlanticist.
Yeah.
And I suppose you've still got the Americans at the time of writing still had the pioneering sort of space program as well. So I can see the basis for it. But I did like the idea that you were sort of, you had to be dragged kicking and screaming to actually become the president. They'd sort of figured out that no one who wanted to be president should be allowed
to be, yes.
And they sort of basically picked a number out of the phone book.
But But yeah, that's always my theory. Anybody who wants to be in charge shouldn't be allowed to be. Yeah, because somebody who wants that sort of power.
That's a very sort of Athenian idea of democracy. You basically, in the very short time that Athens was practicing their, doing their democratic experiment, that you were just literally picked out of a hat, or the equivalent of. But yeah, and the world president seems to be almost like a ceremonial post. You have it for a year, and they decided because it's the 500th year of the United States, then we'll give it, we'll make the US world president as well. But yes, was there a UN? I'm not sure if there was a UN.
No, there wasn't. There wasn't officially. I assume there was, because he didn't really go into sort of the whole geopolitical way the Earth worked. We sort of said it was a very American centric, so we didn't really. He mentioned other countries, but they didn't really sort of mention how they politically sort of interacted, because I wasn't sure whether the world president ruled. They just had one world president and everybody else was in charge, or whether the countries worked independently.
And to be honest, this was my initial disappointment, especially in the first section reading this, because this is called Imperial Earth, and I was perhaps expecting something a little bit more like Foundation. But this isn't. I mean, this isn't very imperial. It's quite bureaucratic, which I suppose comes late in the Imperial project. But it's there's not very much in the way of politics there, which the title sort of.
I assumed it was going to be somebody literally setting up an empire, and it wasn't.
No, I mean there is an empire of sorts, but it's very, it's very low stakes. And if you think about it, the whole book is very low stakes as well. Okay, this is about the economy of hydrogen on a moon of Saturn. Okay, I'm going to try to get excited about that, but he's like looking for a way to replace this economy, because he can see that the progress is continuing. So Duncan travels back from Titan to Earth, on this new ship, which has a different way of different method of propulsion, and finagles a way to go in and see how this is working. And this is I did like this idea. The whole propulsion idea of it. It creates a miniature black hole just in front of the ship and is perpetually dragging itself forward.
Yes, that sounded pretty risky to me, but
yeah, but they seem to have it sorted. And he's sort of very taken with this idea, and then quickly realizes that right, you're not going to need any hydrogen for this. What else are we going to do? Yeah. And then he realizes that his one-time friend Carl has sort of already come to this conclusion. And is this the time to talk about Carl, perhaps?
Could be, because the latter sort of third of the book is, it sets up, you think, it's going to be sort of espionage and all interesting things like that, and then it sort of peters out, and it's not really. But as you said, Carl, his longtime friend, has been going around exploring all the moons and all the satellites, and basically been away, and he went down to Earth without telling anybody, and
which is quite a difficult thing to do, given the preparation that Duncan has to put in to acclimatize his body beforehand to be able to even exist on Earth. You've got to do a lot of exercising, a lot of weight training and stuff like this.
But they brush over that with Carl a bit by saying, he originally was born on Earth, so his body would have adapted quite quickly, which I found a bit spurious, because I would have thought, well, even if you've been born somewhere, if you spent the last 40 years living somewhere else with no gravity, your body will have adapted to that.
Well, those astronauts that were stuck up in a space station for longer than they were intending to be, from earlier this year, when they got back, one of them gets on the, gets out of the capsule and has to be picked up off the floor, and that's after sort of 6-9 months. After 40 years, that's going to be there's going to be some serious atrophy has occurred.
Yeah. What made me laugh was when Duncan was coming to Earth, they were like, he was trying to train himself to be there, and they literally had a velodrome in the spaceship.
I've got to think
cycling around this velodrome.
He must have been thinking of that scene in 2001, running around.
Oh yes,
running around that, but doing it on a bike. I mean, it's there are some. I do like there's a gentle humour in a lot of Clarke, and he does put these sort of fairly incongruous images in your head when he writes this sort of thing. I mean, in terms of him writing about the future as well, he pretty much has the internet sorted. I don't think he hasn't figured out search engines, but he's at least got the databases in place.
Yeah, what I did find interesting, which I've seen done before, is they have this little handheld device called the Logi something.
Minisec.
Sorry, I've got Logisec, which is actually a piece of software in my head. Minisec. And it's meant to be fantastic and does all these things, but it does everything but lets you talk to somebody else. So you still got to talk to each other through like wired in video phones. So he's taken the leap to that, but he's not taken the leap further to think, well, maybe people would be able to talk to each other individually, which, considering this is post Star Trek with the communicators, I find quite fascinating that he didn't take that little leap. It always interesting with the technology that people accidentally predict and the ones that they don't.
Especially seeing as he's the communication satellite guy.
Oh yeah, true.
We're obviously on a mission here to get you to love Arthur C. Clarke, and this isn't, I don't think, the gateway to anyone wanting to read Arthur C. Clarke. It's good enough. It's a slice of life, but there isn't enough happening in the book to say, right, you know what, this is the one you need to read, in my opinion.
Yeah. He does what I've noticed in the other Clarke that I read before, is you get his chapters are always quite short, but every now and then you get a chapter that's basically telling you all the technical specifications of something that happened before, and it's just, it is just exposition. And he just every now and then sort of intersperses one of these things to try and explain all these scientific stuff, and it feels like I've done all this research, so I'm going to tell you about these.
It's always difficult to figure out a way to convey this, because, I mean, your alternatives are by constantly interrupting the narrative to explain each individual thing. So, making breakfast is going to take 10 pages as he explains how, the toaster works, all this sort of stuff. Or you have an annoying character who is basically always asking the questions that the reader would be asking. And it's like, well, how are you existing in the future if you're having to always ask how a computer works or what a minisec is? At least with doing it this way, he's compartmentalizing that sort of info dump.
Because I enjoyed this more than, I can't remember the name of the book, the one with the space elevator.
Not Fountains of Paradise, is it?
Yes, it is Fountains of Paradise. Right. Yeah, which was the last Clarke I read, and I actually enjoyed this more than that. Which, considering that's meant to be one of his best books of, one of his classic books of Fountains of Paradise, it's probably saying more about me than it is about him.
I've not read Fountains of Paradise yet. That's one I'm missing.
Yeah. I'll be interested to reread it at some point. It's one of these ones I'm great for rereading stuff after if I've read an author and I didn't like an earlier book and I've got into them later, I'd like to go back to their earlier books to find out, well, maybe I did like that one but didn't realize I liked it, sort of thing.
He does mention a space elevator briefly in this.
Yeah, no, I like space elevators. I've got a thing about them.
Oh, it's a great idea. It might still happen.
Yeah, I've got Charles Shepard's Web of the World that came out at the same time. Is really good. I really like. And there's a great bit in the fact that he wrote to Arthur C. Clarke because he suddenly discovered that Arthur C. Clarke was writing the same story about a space elevator, and Clarke wrote him this big letter to say, sometimes it's time for an idea, and people come up with similar ideas at the same time.
Yep.
And there's this letter.
Hollywood's always doing it.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a letter in the beginning of the copy I've got that says about that. But because I read those two together. I read Web of the World after I'd read Phantoms of Paradise. And Phantoms of Paradise, I think it's this characterization I always get problems with, like the Fall of Moon Dust.
No, I like Fall of Moon Dust.
But saying that, I've got a copy of a 1980 something radio adaptation done by the BBC that I listened to last week, and it's actually really good. That made me like the story even more.
I mean, it's a proper sort of disaster.
You
know, it is. I think you described it as Poseidon Adventure on the Moon. It's like, yeah, absolutely, sign me up. It is great fun.
Yeah, because you've got all the characters that sort of fit the things. You've got the engineer, you've got the captain, you've got the ex-astronaut who's showing off.
You would, if you're on a whatever it is, a ship that's going across the moon's surface, you are going to have an engineer. You are going to have the captain.
Yeah.
It does. It lends itself to it. It is simultaneously futuristic and dated, which I like, and I know.
Oh yeah,
which is sort of tickling your brain at the moment as well.
Yeah, what made me laugh about it was when they say to one of the women, "Oh, go make the coffees or something," and it's like, "Go get the drinks," and it's like, "Oh no."
Yeah, that you do have that issue. I think that issue lessens with later Clarke. He is very much. You very much have gender roles until the end of the 1950s, I think, with him.
Because I've said that I've read some shorts of his. I've read The Sentinel, and I've read a couple of others around him. Sentinel I quite liked. I've not read the actual novel of 2001 though. Actually, did I? I may have read it years ago and totally forgotten about it.
Well, I read the Lost Worlds of 2001 recently. So I mean, The Sentinel's in there. I had read that before, but it's in there again, and there's all these additional scenes that didn't make the final cut for the 2001 novel, which is or alternate. Alternate. I say scenes because the film and the book are just sort of bound so much together. And he's writing stuff, and then it's being vetoed by the film director. So he goes away and does something else. In the end, it makes a much better piece. But it's nice to see all of these roads that didn't get, that weren't travelled down. But I think if I'm suggesting one to you, I would say you might have already read it and hated it. But Rendezvous with Rama.
Read it many, many years ago, and from what I remember, I found it dull. But it's probably time to reread it, and because I've got into more. This sounds bad. I enjoy duller stuff now. Which sounds, but not dull in a bad way. Sort of more measured things. I don't expect stuff to happen all the time, and I think that's the thing comes. The more you read, you don't want everything to slap you around the head.
I mean, I wouldn't say dull. It's all like he is, because it's hard science fiction. He is bound by what's, if not probable, plausible. So from getting to A to B, he's going to take the length of time it gets from A to B. There's narrative, there's writerly ways to get around that, but scientifically, he sticks to the rules entirely. What else is there? There's is it the Hammer of God? I think it's the Hammer of God. That's impending meteor. His take on that, and again, it's high stakes, but not huge excitement. But it's really well done.
Yeah, Childhood's End is the other one that comes to mind. Which is
now that's much more out there from his perspective. That's much more sort of that is proper sort of flights of fancy. And again, it's something that takes a long time. I like the idea that the aliens arrive and then just sit there for years until everyone's used to them. and then they start talking to them, but don't let anyone see them again for years and years. Well, I don't want to give any spoilers away for that book. Here.
I saw a very bad film of it a few years back.
I should imagine it's a really bad film of it. Yeah.
Because they obviously tried to action it up, which is always a problem. It's a bit like in
not an action.
Yeah, that's the problem with when you try and take some of these novels and try to do something with them, and you think there's nothing in them. It's like Apple's adaptation of Foundation. They've actioned it up, and I watched about 2 episodes of it. But no, I can't face this. It's like they've read Clarke, and not Clarke, read Asimov, liked the idea, and then just gone off and done something totally different.
They have gone and done that, which I'm sort of fine with that, because I think if you'd have watched an adaptation of Foundation, it was absolutely fake. It would be terrible.
Lots of many rooms.
It would show how dated it was. I think with certain things, you've got to sort of make stuff a bit more amenable to today's audience, and especially if you've got any idea of selling it.
Yeah, I just, from the bits I saw, I just thought you could have done this and stuck more to. To me, it felt like they sort of read Asimov and sort of liked the idea and just ignored it.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a bit better.
Yeah, I haven't. I've at times I've been thought, I might have to go back and watch this. But I think Asimov, like Clarke, is a hard one to adapt. Clarke, if you think of the adaptations they've done, in very few and far between. 2001 worked because basically Kubrick got him to write it along as he was making it.
Yeah, and Kubrick knew this wasn't going to be an action film. And it is not an action film. Stuff happens, important stuff happens, but it happens at the pace at which a very measured, careful mission is planned out.
But Kubrick's such a good director, he managed to put tension in the slow things. Like how going totally mad was just the slow tension of that. Just the way Clarke writes, he did the same in the film. Like you'd notice one thing about Hal doing, and then nothing would occur to that till half an hour later in the film. And Clarke does that in his books, is he will imply something and then you won't hear about it till later, which happened in this book. You knew that Carl was going to be important, and something about Carl exploring the asteroids was important, but you didn't know what. And then he sort of disappeared and nobody mentioned him for the next sort of 50, 100 pages. 50, 100 pages. And then suddenly you found out he was on Earth, and it all sort of started working from that point. Because, spoilers ahead, the whole thing he was working on was to do with space telescopes, to radio telescopes to communicate with so-called space aliens if they could find any. And this was what Duncan decided could be a new industry.
Yeah, this is one of the big set pieces. I mean, there seems to be 2 big set pieces at the back end of this book. One, I'm not quite sure what the importance is. Come to it in a moment. And the other one is this
final bit.
No, the space telescope is the second bit. So you I mean, I can imagine that working very well in a film. He lands, I think it's in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But it's a project of space telescopes that has been created, but then pretty much left to rust. And this is how's it rusting in the desert? It's because no one had foreseen that they were able to sort of change the climate to suit, sort of almost to reseed the desert. But it's played havoc with the space telescopes. But that whole sort of idea, there's a vista of just hundreds of rusting telescopes, was quite a nice. It's a nice image. The bit that I didn't get was the raising of the Titanic.
Oh, that was all a bit weird.
It's a big set piece, and I know I'm missing something here, because Titanic and he's from Titan. There's definitely a connection, but what it is, I'm missing the imagery.
But the bit that got me is because Clarke's based in science, he likes his science and what have you, and he was they were saying that they'd raised the Titanic, and because it had been down so low, it never rusted or corroded. Well, I've seen film of it that David Cameron took, and that thing has corroded to hell.
David Cameron?
Yeah. Not David Cameron, James Cameron, yes. David Cameron may have gone down there as well.
I mean, I'm quite happy to send David Cameron to the bottom of the
ocean. He could go down there. But no, James Cameron, when he went down and looked at it and all the film you've seen of it from the drones and stuff like that, thing is corroded to hell. So
this is about 8 years before the wreck was found, I think he was writing this.
Yeah, but I would have thought the signs would still tell you that it corrodes in some shape or form.
Yeah, but then again, he's so meticulous about this stuff. I should imagine that he's read a paper where someone says it's going to be so cold down there that it's not going to happen.
Because basically, they raised the thing, put nitrogen into it, and then restored it, and now people. But they said that things like they found the food, and the food was edible. I thought, huh? I wouldn't want to eat it.
But this all seems to be done because they can, not because it's important. There seems, so when he goes back to Earth and he meets Kalindi is part of this big events firm that just does big events for no discernible reason.
Yes, but he's predicted the events industry, hasn't he?
Yeah. So, or do we blame him?
Yeah, we could blame him for that, probably.
I mean, between that and that big sort of sphere they got up in Las Vegas.
Yes.
Yeah, there was an odd interlude.
Yeah, because I thought something was going to happen. I thought it was going to go somewhere. We were going to discover something. But because it was a big event just to show the fact that Kalindi, because at this point she sees him, but she doesn't want him to know that Carl's actually staying with her.
Yeah, so she sees him and gives him the cold shoulder.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the whole scene doesn't quite work for me because I can't figure out why we have to have this sort of raising the Titanic. Nice idea though it is. And for all that to be, and someone's giving me the brush off. But then when he gets the space telescopes, he does meet Carl. And, that meeting goes even worse.
Yes, because it was really weird because I read that. Because basically Carl falls off the top, basically. But it's because somebody tries to shoot him. But they were really vague about that in the scene. So I actually read the scene, and I don't know whether it's me. And later on when they're talking, and they said, such and such was trying to protect you, so they shot him. I thought, they shot him? I thought he just fell off the thing. So I had to go back and reread it.
Well, it's a sort of bit of both, isn't it? Because he wasn't shot. I think it's some sort of special gun which fired a blinding light.
Yeah, because they were just saying about a light at the time, and he fell off. And there was
it half catches Duncan, and he's half blinded.
Yeah.
And it fully blinds Carl, and he topples over the edge. But they're doing it because they think Carl is going to attack him.
Yeah. See, when that was written in the scene, I thought it was just because they mentioned earlier on about Duncan's problem with light, so he had to wear darker glasses than anybody else, because obviously he's been on the moon. So I thought it was just a case of maybe the sun had moved around and got through the trees a bit more, and that's why the light came through. To me, that wasn't clear until later. It was mentioned that had happened, and I went back and reread it and thought, oh yes, I see it now. I missed that, but
yeah, it all happened very quickly.
It was all very matter of factly in it, and I tried to work out sort of plot wise why he needed to kill that character, because I don't.
There isn't really a need to, other than the fact that we've then got this additional section of where he tries to find out what the big secret was that he's been hiding. And why Carl has steered clear of Duncan for all these years. And there seems to be two reasons.
Yeah.
One is that he's been permanently psychologically altered by plugging himself into some kind of joy box.
Yes, they called it the joy box or something like that.
And one that he has discovered this secret, which does take it right back to the beginning of the book, which I did like. And he really doesn't want to let Duncan in on this secret because he knows that the Mackenzie clan is going to monopolize all of it and take over. And I think he wants to do something himself.
See that? I think that might have made a more interesting story, with shenanigans between them trying to set something up around the Mackenzie clan.
Yeah, and that would have been a little bit more sort of Imperial, shenanigans as well. As it is, then a couple more things happen, and I did like that last twist. He has, I mean, in a way, Carl wins. But in the meantime, I think maybe just a bit before this, but he takes a couple of visits to this cloning place.
Yeah.
So the guy that's created him as a clone and has created his father clone as a clone, has had a change of heart and he refuses to do any more cloning. He sees it as ethical considerations with it. You don't need to be cloning yourself. And then we find out that's because the cloning scientist has himself created a clone of himself who he then had a disagreement with. So he goes to this other person and gets his clone done there. But, these aren't lab grown. They're lab conceived clones, but they're not lab grown clones. And this is the bit I was talking about right at the beginning of our conversation.
Oh, yes.
I was uncomfortable with. The host mothers, they are described as being, I can't remember the term he used, but basically they are, they're mentally disabled, but they really want to have children. And it's just like,
that was
he's
a bit
putting an awful lot onto this idea at this point. It's like, well, yes, they may well want to have children, but the whole idea of having children is you get to keep them afterwards, which isn't going to
I would
happen.
have thought they also probably wouldn't emotionally be in a state to give the child up easily.
No. And I think of all the pieces in the book, this is the bit I had the issue with the most. It's only a few pages, and he doesn't describe anyone in distress, but it's the fact that he can't seem to see that this would cause distress, which I found odd. It didn't seem to be something that had been thought through.
I think that obviously relates to the first bit that we were on about, when obviously the daughter, and that's, I think, points to the fact this is sort of Clarke's viewpoint at the time, because he can't see, as you said, he can't see the distress. And I would like to, I said, I don't really know his full sort of biography or anything, so I would be quite interested to read a biography to see if there's something in his background that sort of shows where this sort of viewpoint comes from, because I don't think it's a viewpoint he was trying to put on the characters.
It just seems to be a massive blind spot more than anything else.
Yeah, I just find it quite intriguing. But then, if you remember, in the 70s, basically anybody who was anybody ended up in a mental hospital at the time.
Yeah,
really
and at the time, I mean, I think you were still having sort of state-sponsored eugenicist stuff happening in Sweden until the early 70s.
And ECT all the time, and
yeah, I mean, in a way, obviously this is 50 years old. It's going to be dated. It still seems quite futuristic in some ways and quite progressive in some ways, but there are elements in it which I would have thought, even at the time, someone, an editor would have picked up on this, but perhaps that's just me failing to read the situation back in 1976.
But
I was in nappies myself.
But it was still like, I've recently been rewatching Life on Mars, and I'm watching it, and if people don't know it, it's basically set in the guy basically goes back to the 1970s in a police station in the 1970s. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, the sort of racism, the sexism, that was it like that, or are they just extrapolating and making it more? And I'm trying to think back, because obviously I was born in 1968, so I remember the back end of the 70s, but I cannot remember it being like that. But maybe that was because I was a child and it was to me. And then I spoke to a friend of mine who's probably about 5 or 6 years older than me, and I said, "So was the 70s like that?" And he said, "There was bits of it, but it wasn't as bad as it's been portrayed as there," which I found quite interesting. So I think a lot of the time we extrapolate these ideas at these points in time were incredibly, because you hear about the racism, sexism, that you assume that everybody was and everything is. But if what was the bit I saw? Something come to my mind that I thought was really the Kinks, Lola. I went down a rabbit hole on YouTube the other day. Don't ask me how I did it. People reacting to Lola, which is hilarious, especially the Americans. Watching Americans react to Lola, because when you get to the end of the song and they suddenly realise that Lola's actually a man, it's quite hilarious. But that was in back into the 60s, and I remember the song, or was it early 70s?
I think that was a 70s song. I think it's a bit later, but yeah.
But I remember that song, and I remember it being played around and what have you. And people didn't bat an eyelid at the fact that Lola was a man at the time. And in some ways, viewpoints have become more ingrained now against stuff like that. And that, yes, there was homophobia, there was sexism back in the 70s, but I have a feeling it's a lot more people just didn't care at the time. Yes, it was a man.
Yeah.
Well, what the hell?
Well, they didn't feel they had to show that they cared all the time, which you sort of have to do now. But I mean, I suggest that probably some people just didn't realise what the song was, just didn't catch on.
Oh, that's not the bad guy.
Yeah, it's I think probably you'll find that attitudes were a lot more progressive in just the normal run of the mill things than you are being shown. But then if you look at something like, you look at Alf Garnett, it's just like, well, you have the counterweight to Alf Garnett in that show there. It shows that people were more politically conscious and, sort of against that sort of Garnett reactionary kind of behavior at the time as well.
Yeah, so you had both sort of signs of it. So I don't think, so as you said, and if you look at the science fiction of the 70s, it's all a lot of it anyway, is very progressive. You still have some hangovers from the sort of like 50s, people whose sort of styles and haven't changed. But if you look at the big sort of names who've come through, then sort of Harlan Ellison, who's, as much as he was writing since the 50s, he became really, really known about the stuff. And you got Philip Jose Farmer, who went off on one of his books that's stunning, and they are so progressive. Christopher Priest, you name all the big names around then, and it's all quite progressive in all sorts of new wave. Even Philip K. Dick, it's just like, what is going on here after time? And I know Sean Stanfast hates, not hates, but dislikes Philip K. Dick, and he dislikes that progressive thing because he thinks it changed science fiction to a degree, which I can understand, because it did. It went off less of the hard science fiction and more into the sort of fantastical elements of science fiction. But Clarke has managed to, through that, sort of stuck and kept it hard, but also, as I said, in this novel, kept the sort of progressive edge to it as well, though. So he managed to move on.
The science fiction isn't just about always the technology. And I think what you've got here is that he's saying, well, actually, what's going to happen to the people as well? And despite the failings which we've talked about, you can really see he's making the efforts here.
Yeah.
He's possibly writing against certainly how he's been brought up, thinking, well, how are things going to... how are things going to develop? And he gets, if he's got a main failing, he's far too hopeful. Things have turned out much worse.
What was I going to say then? Yes, that was one of the things I was thinking. I was saying that I wrote a note down. Where is it? Yes, saying that you get people who say they don't read science fiction because they hate science fiction, and this book is a prime example of why I think when people say that, they've not really read science fiction. They've either made the assumption it's all about spaceships and laser guns, or they've only read those sort of actiony ones. They've not, because science fiction is such a wide genre. You have anything comedy to fantasy to
Historical.
It is one of the widest
counter histories, counterfactuals.
Yeah, it's basically historical fiction. Half of it is, it's as you said, and so I think saying that you dislike a genre like that, I think, especially science fiction, is quite a difficult one to say because it just, to me, it's just such a wide field, and I think this novel shows it really well because it's not really. Take it to its bones, it's not really a science fiction book. If you take away the hard science fiction, it's just a story of a man traveling somewhere and trying to open trade deals.
Yeah, he's on the grand tour.
Yeah, and you could do that story. You could place it in the 18th century or the 19th century or anywhere, and you could tell the same story. It's just that this version of it has got lots of technology, and what he's trading in is hydrogen, which they're trying to sort out. And
yeah, that's it. Switch the hydrogen out for nutmeg. Change the clones for illegitimate children, and this is an 18th century colonizing book.
Yeah, and that's where I think this book shows it quite well. I must admit, if I was trying to say introduce somebody to science fiction, I would not pick this book.
No, I'm definitely glad I've read it. But if you're going to say, right, if you're going to make a list of the top 5 Arthur C. Clarke books to start with, this isn't top 5.
I did a search on YouTube before I spoke to you. I spent 5 minutes and did a search under this, and I think there's about 2 videos on it. It's hardly anybody's actually spoken about this book, and I think it's
a gap in the market for you.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of not blown under the radar. I think because it's quite a slow book and not one of his best books, it sort of flies under the radar.
But I think it really helps filling in the blanks of you're seeing his progression, not in the sort of the technological side of it, but the progression of him as a writer. There is more character. The characters are more rounded here than they are in earlier works, and there is more focus on the individuals rather than them just being the flesh components of a scientific experiment.
Yes, I did like the characterization of Duncan in this. I thought especially once he started on his grand tour, he got a lot more rounded out. And I said, weirdly, not that I've read huge amounts of Clarke, this is probably my favourite of the Clarkes I've read.
Well, I'm glad. I was worried when I got about halfway through this. I thought, this isn't going to convince Duncan.
It's not convinced me 100% on him, but I said he's still one of these authors I think I should love him. But this has got me sort of interested in to pick up some of his other stuff, especially around this period. I'm not sure what else he published around this period.
Well, I mean, I think you are sort of looking at sort of Rama, and he's much more into his sequels by that point, I would have thought.
Yeah. There's about 3 sequels to Rama, which he did with other people, didn't he?
Yes, he did it with Gentry Lee, who is, he's like, Gentry Lee is he worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
For some reason, I always thought Gentry Lee was a woman. I don't know why.
I think it's a man.
Yeah, you're probably right because I've seen books around, and may have read the odd short story, but
I'm going to have to check now. I'm sure Gentry Lee was a man.
Yeah, probably. It's just for some reason the name made me think. Then I used to think Julian May was a man, and it's a woman.
Well, I mean, that's a bit more understandable.
Yeah. When she died, I discovered that she was a woman.
Well, there we go. Like Evelyn Waugh, that confuses people from time to time. No, Gentry Lee is a man.
Yeah.
But don't get him confused with Geddy Lee, who's a bassist.
Yeah. The Wonderful Rush.
Yeah. Well, okay. We'll have to figure out. I was going to say, well, what next to try and convince you? But I mean, the ones I'm pulling off the shelf are definitely not from the same times. I've got like the Sands of Mars, which is probably a step back in writing terms from Imperial Earth. But I've got the Other Side of the Sky as well. I'm just thinking I must have something, but I'd say maybe Rama is worth a revisit.
Yeah, I said I'd probably read that. I would have been about 14 when I read that.
I think you get a lot more from it this time.
Yeah,
a proper sort of big dumb object science fiction.
But yeah, I must have been about 14 when I read that. I was just sort of. I think that's when I cleared out the local library. I used to live in Portland in Dorset, and we moved there, and it had a tiny little library which was like 2 porter cabins. And within 6 months, I read everything that I possibly could out of that library.
Anyway, look, I mean, in conclusion, I'm glad you enjoyed this because, like I said, I was worried. It's just like, well, God, there's not a lot happening here.
Yeah, I would have liked
very
it
much
to be
a slice of life.
I would have liked it to be more Imperial. I would like to have more Roman Empire really in it, but
yeah, I want people wearing robes and cloaks in the next one.
Oh, yeah, we need to bring cloaks back in fashion. Why do people know? Cloaks need to come back. But yes, no, more Empire would have been good in it. But for what sounds a bit damning for what it was an enjoyable read. I enjoyed it. I said the first half, I thought this is slow and it's getting off. And once we got past, once we got past the chapters with the exposition in, because as much as I find it quite interesting, which is where Clarke doing short chapters works quite well because you haven't got huge amounts of it. Yeah. And then you got onto the actual sort of grand tour bit. That's when I really got into it, and I got quite invested into it and really enjoyed that bit. The thriller bit that I thought was coming at the end that ended up a bit of a sort of damp squib in the end, but it was saying it's nice sounds really bad, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, the espionage bit peters out, but then there was this big revelation. So
yes, but that's what I was going to ask you. Okay, so we are spoiling the end of this. So he's at the cloning office and he's debating in his head about clones. Whereas earlier on, when the guy that turned him down was saying the reason he turned him down, and he almost was agreeing with him to some degree. So he goes to the cloning office and they say they've got 4 viable embryos and they're going to implant 1 and what have you. But then he goes back to Titan and he pulls back and shows the baby off, and that's how it ends. And the baby's obviously got red hair, and I wonder whether the red hair was something I'd missed. So is that baby a clone or not?
It's not his clone; it's Carl's clone.
Oh, I missed that, did I? I knew there was something I was missing. I was thinking it was the red hair bit. They said the red hair, and I thought they made a point of that for some reason. What am I missing here?
Yeah, it's not. This is why he's saying, he's thinking, Christ, they're going to be angry with me.
Yeah, I know. That's why I was trying to think.
And he's seen his grandmother, and his grandmother already knows what he's done, and she approves. Mm-hmm. So this is his way of making peace with Carl.
I missed that. That was stupid of me, wasn't it?
And ending the Mackenzie line.
Yes. But then it's... Do you count the end of a line biologically or non-biologically is the question.
Well, they're just not in the phone book anymore. Or they won't be after another couple of centuries because everyone seems to live 200 years anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, how did I miss that? I must admit, I don't think it was obvious, but maybe it's me. It was just the way they said it, and he pulled it back, and I said, okay, some red hair. There's something about the red hair, isn't there?
I think he's got red hair.
Oh,
but
damn,
Carl's got blonde hair.
But sorry, I've got it now. Because as you said earlier, we found out that he was black. So I should have realised that. Because when they made a point of the fact of his skin colour earlier, the red hair,
pink scalp bore an unmistakable trace of hair, golden hair that would soon bring back to Tyson the lost glories of the distant sun.
Yeah.
So
I should have twigged because they were saying about his dark skin earlier in comparison, and the fact that there was no sort of really, really dark Afro-Caribbean people anymore, and I should have twigged that with the ginger hair and the pink skin.
I would have liked to have seen the next scene when Malcolm sees the baby, but there you go. You can't have everything.
Oh God, I'm an idiot missing that. No, I knew there was something there, but it was just.
But yeah, I mean, this is in a way, it's all like that bit where you have to go back and reread the bit where Carl dies. It's like, wait a minute, what just happened? he seems to be so matter of fact about these things. There's no dramatic order.
I wouldn't say it's scientific, but it's very easy to read. He's very he's not somebody who goes for like flowery metaphors or ridiculousness like that. It's all sort of nice, easy, sort of laid back reading in some ways, the way the prose comes together. And I think that's why I missed that, was because it was just done in such a sort of matter-of-fact way. And also he said the bit with the gun earlier, but I probably would have done some research later today and thought, oh good God, I missed that, did I?
I hope I'm right. I mean, that's how I read it. Anyway.
It totally makes sense now. It absolutely makes sense, because this was, I think they said because this is a total standalone, isn't there? There's no other books set in this universe or anything like that. So
yeah, this is on its own.
So anybody watching this, you caught this live, I missed the ending. I didn't get it.
To change your opinion of the book, we can do this in real time.
No, I still quite like the book, and the fact that it did that to me, I like.
Excellent.
Because it means that
Clarke.
It could have been one of these ones I go back 2 years later, reread, and suddenly realise at the ending, you thought, how the hell did I miss that the first time?
Yeah, well, I suppose. Yeah, and because there's very little written about it elsewhere, it's one of those where it isn't sort of common currency.
Yeah, there's not much about it. I did a bit. I like to, after I read a book, have a quick look around roughly at people's reviews to see what people were saying about it, just to see if they concur with me or anything. But there wasn't much around it. I didn't actually go onto Goodreads and stuff because Goodreads reviews go down a weird rabbit hole when you start looking at them sometimes.
Well, you'll find someone who absolutely hates it and somebody who thinks it's the best thing ever. So
it's just Songs of Distant Earth is the other one I've got that I've not read of his.
Oh, I've got that and I've not read it, so maybe we'll have that as the next one.
Yeah, we can do, because I read the synopsis of it and quite liked it, the sound of it. And also I like the Michael Whelan cover.
Excellent. Okay, well then that's a date.
Okay, so if anybody's watched this far, I think we'll end our discussion with a few offshoots to God knows where, as these things always do. And thanks everybody for watching, and I said we will do another one soon, and that will be up on Gavin's channel for the next one we do, whatever we do. I think we've got a few things vaguely planned, but we won't tell you what they are because we're not quite sure ourselves.
We'll figure it out first.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Okay. Bye.